In my response, I would like to focus on one aspect of your lecture, the question to what extent the Ecclesia is one people who participate in one covenant, and to what extent it consists of different peoples with different ways of life. I will engage with this question through an exploration of the book of Acts on this point, because that is the material I am most familiar with, and also with a detour through the work of the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. I'll first recapitulate what you have said about this in your lecture. First of all, you state that Judaism and Christianity are part of a single but twofold people of God. Further, you differentiate between Messianic Jews and Messianic Judaism. Messianic Jews belong to the Jewish people because they are born as Jews, or I assume have undergone a full conversion process to become legally Jewish. Some of these Messianic Jews practice Judaism, that is, they adhere to the Jewish calendar and more generally to the way prescribed by the written and oral Torah. You also point at the fact that Gentiles may practice Messianic Judaism by celebrating Jewish festivals, for example, without being Messianic Jews. However, this is not necessary or even desirable. You reject the Christian Torah movement, according to which the Torah equally applies to all believers. The Messianic Jews are called to covenant fidelity. And this covenant in question is not a universal gift, but the distinctive bond uniting the Jewish people to God. Likewise, the statement of the Vilnius conference last year also speaks of covenant fidelity as something to which Jewish disciples of Yeshua are called. And it does not say whether this is also true for non-Jewish disciples of Jesus. So this raised for me the question, where does that leave me as a Gentile Christian? Am I also called to covenant fidelity or not? If I'm part of God's people, why should I not keep the Torah for God's people? And I will delve into that through the book of Acts. Because the ambiguity that is inherent in this discussion is inherited from the book of Acts, as well as the letters of Paul to some extent. The Gospel of Matthew can very well be read as supporting the Christian Torah movement. Jesus teaches his disciples to make all the nations his disciples and to command them what he had commanded his disciples, which is keep the law. But in Acts we read the decision that believers from the nations do not need to keep the entire Torah. Still, they do receive a share among the sanctified, according to Acts 26, verse 18. On the one hand, these believers are ethnically distinct from Jewish believers. They are Athenians, Romans, Lycaonians, etc. And notably, the book of Acts never speaks about the Ecclesia as one people. Instead, it seems to speak about two peoples, though only once. First, the people of Israel, of which Jesus is the anointed king, many of whom oppose the gospel, but many others also believe. And second, James at the Apostolic Council speaks about a people from the Gentiles, or from the nations, that God has called as well, in line with the prophecy from Amos. On the other hand, as they are called to worship the God of Israel, these Gentile believers become to some extent Jewish. Cult is an important indication of ethnicity in the ancient world. This is something that Paula Fredrickson, for example, stresses in relation to the letters of Paul. His gospel is not law-free. He Judaizes the nations if he requires them to worship the God of Israel. Also, these believers receive a share among the sanctified, as I just said, which means that they will inherit covenant promises promised to Abraham and his seed. So how would they not be called to covenant fidelity then? Christopher Stroop and others have pointed out that Luke uses the category of the proselyte to explain and legitimate the position of the Gentile believers within the Ecclesia. Proselytes and God-fearers are not so clearly distinguished in Luke Acts. In Acts 2, pious Jews from every nation are in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. And this phrase, Jews from every nation, already suggests some kind of hybrid ethnicity. They are Jews following Jewish customs and worshipping the Jewish God, but they speak the language of the country where they live. But moreover, among these Jews are both Jews and proselytes. So here the proselytes are distinguished from born Jews, but they're nevertheless, in some sense, Jewish. We then find, especially in Acts 13, a mixing up of the categories of proselyte and God-fearer. Paul addresses those present in the synagogue of Antioch as Andres Israelitai kai hoi verbumenoi ton theon, Israelite men, and those who fear God. And after the synagogue gathering, Paul and Barnabas are followed by many Jews and reverent proselytes, God-fearing proselytes, if you will. At the next Sabbath, the entire city shows up in the synagogue, and that means, in fact, that this nondescript category of proselytes or God-fearers grows with an enormous influx of Gentiles, of ethne, and that raises concerns among the Jews. In the next city, in Iconium, Paul and Barnabas can speak in the synagogue to Jews and Greeks. So proselytes, God-fearers, Gentiles in the synagogue, Greeks in the synagogue, it seems to be more or less the same. In Corinth, in Acts 18, Paul tries to persuade both Jews and Greeks in the synagogue, and after resistance from Jews, Paul moves to the neighboring house of the God-fearer Titus Justus. The implication of all this is that there is nothing really new about the communities of adherents of the way, of the disciples of the Lord. Throughout the Roman Empire, synagogues existed where Jews and Gentiles worshipped together the God of Israel. Forced out of these synagogues, Paul teaches in homes where similar groups come together. Also, the communities that gather for Paul's teaching consist of Jews and Gentiles who worship the God of Israel together. Their disagreements with the other Jewish communities are intra-Jewish disagreements. The way is a school within Judaism, a hieresis, with particular viewpoints which can be discussed, as Paul does in Acts 28, with the Jewish leaders in Rome. And the issue at the Apostolic Council, in fact, is which halacha applies to proselytes or God-fearers. Pharisees in the Ecclesia argue that they should keep the entire law of Moses. This position is in line with the later rabbinic halacha on proselytes. However, the Spirit decides differently according to Acts 15. Gentile believers need only keep 4 things. There's been much discussion about the background of these commands. Are they all related to the prohibition of idolatry? Or is this a version of the Noahide laws? Isaac Oliver has suggested, following earlier Jacob Jervel, that these 4 commandments derive from Leviticus 17 and 18, which contain laws that pertain explicitly to both the born Israelite and the stranger, the ger, or the proselyte in the Septuagint. I think this is a helpful suggestion, and it combines well with the other interpretation. The main thing required from foreigners living in Israel is that they do not commit idolatry. And further, the Noahide laws are by no means fixed in the first century, and it makes sense that they align with what is required from strangers in the land. If this is correct, Luke draws on a different halachic conception of proselytes than what we find in rabbinic literature. A similar view can be found, however, in the work of Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher living in the 1st century. In an article in the Studia Philonica Annual from 2022, Jeff Hubbard has argued that according to Philo, proselytes do not have to undergo physical circumcision, and they do not become Jews. He argues that Philo agrees with Paul in this regard, and by extension he also agrees with Luke Acts. The key text here is questions on Exodus 12:2, where Philo claims that the Hebrews were proselytes during their captivity in Egypt because they did not circumcise themselves in Egypt. and that they did not circumcise themselves is based on Joshua 5, verse 2. He defines the proselyte as follows. It states most clearly that a proselyte is not one who has circumcised his foreskin, but one who has circumcised the pleasures, desires, and other passions of the soul. So only on the assumption shared by Philo and his readers that a proselyte does not circumcise, physically at least, it makes sense to speak about the Hebrews in Egypt as proselytes in this context. Also, Philo did not regard proselytes as Jews, says Jeff Hubbard. Indeed, he never calls them Jews, and he never includes them in the same laos or ethnos, the same people, as native-born Jews. He does speak about the Jewish politeia, citizenship, or community perhaps, into which proselytes have entered. Hubbard concludes, although Philo's proselytes participate in the life and worship of the Jewish community, they are not physically circumcised, and Philo does not consider them Jews. This is perhaps putting it a bit too strongly. One could say that Philo's proselytes are Jewish in some sense and not Jewish in another sense. I think this offers a very close parallel with Acts, where the Gentiles join the community of the Ecclesia and they are equally disciples and recipients of the Spirit, but they do not become one people with the Jews and they do not need to practice circumcision. So to conclude, what Luke Acts says about my position as a Gentile Christian is that through Christ I can receive a share in the covenantal promises. This also means that I should practice covenantal fidelity. My life should be a response to the amazing claim that I can share in those things that God promised to Abraham and his offspring. However, my covenantal fidelity does not entail keeping everything that the Torah prescribes for Jews. It only pertains to those things required of Gentiles, and first of all, of course, to fidelity to the Jewish Messiah. There are other texts in the New Testament which could be used to say that I am indeed part of the one people of God, grafted into the olive tree, as Paul says. But Acts only goes so far to say that I am part of the one ecclesia, which is clearly indeed bilateral in Acts. That is quite a challenge to the theology of the Reformed tradition in which I stand, which has always emphasized the unity of the covenant and the unity of the church as people of God from both testaments. I think that we should learn to speak with more differentiation about this. It is important for Christians to realize that they are, to some extent, Jewish, engaging in practices that originated as Jewish practices and that continue to be Jewish practices, such as worshipping the God of Israel and trusting the Messiah of Israel. It is equally important for me as Christian to realize that I'm not a Jew, and especially that we as Christians are not the true Israel, but rather Gentiles, who have joined Israel in their worship of God. Indeed, as you emphasized, the Church needs the post-missionary Messianic Jews to remind them of the distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish disciples of Jesus. So I would like to end with two concrete questions. First of all, to what extent do you think that what you call the single but twofold people of God matches with what we find in the New Testament, and especially in Luke Acts? What does it mean to be a people, the people of God? And secondly, to what extent is it useful or helpful to speak about Gentile Christians as proselytes? Given, of course, that you also acknowledge the rabbinic tradition, which has a very different conception of what it is to be a proselyte. Finally, I am much intrigued by what you said about the hidden sanctifying reality of Yeshua at the center of Jewish life and religious tradition. That's not something to which I have responded now, but it's something that I would love to hear more about. And also about the presence of the Spirit in Jewish life and tradition. Thank you very much.